All right, it's about time. Let's begin. I'd like to welcome all of you to our symposium on Islam. My name is Masood. I teach actually engineering classes here on campus, so this is kind of exciting for me to do something different. A little different from so much math. So we're very glad to have Dr. Bradley Cook back here on campus. I have 10 minutes to introduce the speaker and also go over the program. Of course, Dr. Cook currently serves as provost for Southern Utah University in Cedar City. He is deeply committed to global awareness and international education. Prior to his SUU appointment, he served as the president of the Abu Dhabi Women's College in the United Arab Emirates. Prior to his time in Abu Dhabi, Dr. Cook served as Vice President for Academic Affairs at Utah Valley State College here in Orem, where he academically repositioned the institution for several university status. 19 academic programs and 8 centers and institutes were established during his tenure here at UVU. Dr. Cook has also worked and lived in Egypt and Kuwait and also Saudi Arabia, as I remember. And Dr. Cook, of course, is from Utah, has lived, I was talking to his dad, he's lived all over Utah, in Richfield area, Santaquin, Ogden, was born in Ogden. Anyways, he was actually a good football player too in high school and I think in college. And so anyways, I'll go ahead, turn the time to Dr. Cook, and then after his speech about 12:50 or 12:55, and then we take a break for 15-minute break. After the break, I'll introduce the panelists, and we will have about an hour of panel discussion. So officially, we should end about 2 o'clock, but we have the room reserved until 2:30, and we could have unofficial panel discussion until 2:30. So we're glad to have Dr. Cook back, and would you please join me welcoming Dr. Cook.
Thanks, Masood, and thank you for the invitation from the Islamic Community Center here in Utah Valley. It's really great to be back among a lot of friends. This is like a second home. In fact, Utah Valley is quite deep in my DNA. My father worked here for 17 years as a vice president. My mother worked as a librarian. My very first job, paying job anyway, was here on this campus, and I think I mowed every square inch of this campus as on the grounds crew. So it's great to see friends like Masood and Ruhul and Abdus, new friends like Jeff, and of course old friends like Elaine and Gary and others that have played such I think an impressive role here on this campus. I approached today's topic with hopefully with the appropriate amount of soberness and sensitivity given what we witness in a pretty savage set of attacks over the last several months and over the last few years. I mean, the tragedies in Lahore, at the Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Baghdad, Brussels, Paris, San Bernardino all give us reason to be fearful, give us reason to be anxious. But let me assure you that whatever anxiety that you and I feel, right, about terrorism and violence in the name of religion, that those Muslim friends of ours, those that are in this room, feel it just as poignantly, if not more poignantly than you do. They have every reason to be fearful of this kind of violence. because 80 to 90% of victims of religious terrorism are Muslims. But they have an added burden that they have to carry as citizens here in the United States or people that are working here, an added burden of perhaps mindless reprisals of violence on them. If you can imagine what it might be like, right, to be a Muslim in the United States or in Brussels right now or in France, what kind of anxiety and dread you feel going out into public, and the burden of always having to feel like you have to defend your own religion, defend against the mindless savagery that is done in that name, the tediousness of being misrepresented and misunderstood. This is a reality, I think, of Muslims who live in the United States, those that go here to this university and mine. And we'll get into some I think, issues that I hope will be useful today. And what I hope, if nothing else, that whatever positions that you may hold, that you will suspend them, at least for the hour, to perhaps to consider some other elements. Those of us that are from Utah can maybe on some level, a very minor level, albeit, that we can relate to being misunderstood and misrepresented. So consider all of us that live in Utah, if we travel outside the Utah and we're asked where we're from, and we say Utah, admit it, you know the next worry in the back of your head is, oh, you're from Utah. Are you Mormon? Right? And for most people that's not a problem, but you know what the possible third question is going to be, and that is, how many wives or sister wives do you have? You know, and so we're on our heels a little bit when we understand and know that many Americans understand Mormonism through the lens of Warren Jeffs than they do mainstream Mormonism. We end up being in a position to say, well, wait a minute. Yeah, that's not who we are. That's not how Mormonism is lived in the current day. So we all know, perhaps to some extent in this room, what it's like to be misunderstood. Do we know what it's like to be feared? And I've only had a few minor brushes with that, but it is very unsettling when people make assumptions about you that are immensely irrational and emotional, but to see the actual fear in their eyes because of what you represent is a lesson I'll never forget, even in the brief experiences I've had in that regard. Now, I'm sort of the informal advisor to about 150 Muslim students at Southern, and most of them from Saudi Arabia. But I deal with this. This is a real problem. It's not theoretical. I've had the unfortunate experience of having to sit with students that have been beaten up. Right after the Paris attack, I received a phone call from the Saudi Saudi club leader saying, we're afraid to congregate for Friday prayer, and they had a small little masjid or small little prayer room right off the property of the campus. We're afraid that after all of this, with Paris and everything, we don't think we can gather. My response to them is, we will protect you. I'll have security there. And it wasn't without that the fear wasn't without basis. Their small little masjid had been vandalized at least twice that I know of. So I said, listen, we will have police there. I will be with you as you pray. Because this is what America is about, is really about freedom for you to pray and freedom of religion. And I think that we have to sort of be conscious of the fact that we're in a very highly sort of emotional and sensitive time. So what do we do in terms of constructive dialogue in times like this? 60% of Americans have a negative view of Islam. 40%, or less than 40%, claim to have even met a Muslim. 44% say that Muslims are too extreme in their religious views. 1 in 4 of us would say that we don't want to have a Muslim as a neighbor. And less than half of Americans believe that U.S. Muslims are loyal to the United States. So when I speak to people and to students and others, and I think as many of us as educators have to approach this and realize that in times of high emotion like this, that really people need both a rational argument but also an experiential narrative. So here's what I mean. Bigotry really isn't a result of ignorance per se. But bigotry is really a result of fear, right? And fear is impervious to data. So often when Muslims and those of us that spend a lot of time studying this, we feel that maybe if we just give people enough data, right, that they'll get it. But what we find out, and I think what the message I hope to tell you is really when it comes to this kind of fear, there is no substitute than experience. Get to know a Muslim. I challenge you, you get to know any one of our Muslim friends in this room, they will change whatever negative perspective you might have about them. We have to be careful, I think, that we grow up, right, with our political views as a given, right? We grow up very uncritically often about in the milieu that we grow up in. We don't really challenge those perspectives, and we just largely sort of accept what we grow up. And we create an echo chamber for ourselves, where we surround ourselves with the same people that believe like us, that look like us, think like us. We gravitate to news organizations that sort of perpetuate our own sort of preconceived ideas. And what it underscores for me is that there is this undeniable and powerful urge for humans to identify with a tribe. And what happens when we sort of have these sort of tribal sort of perspectives, it's very difficult to see what life is like for the other tribe. And when we do get a glimpse perhaps on the perspective of the other tribe, we have words and names for those kind of people called traitors, right? But when your other tribe or enemy gets a glimpse of your perspective and understands your perspective, they cease to become your enemy. One of my favorite all-time quotes is from the great British novelist E.M. Forster, who said most of the trouble in the world is due to our inability to imagine the innerness of other lives. Lawrence Kohlberg took it a step further, the great psychologist, who really said that one definition of morality is the capacity to see perspectives other than our own. We call this empathy. And we, I think, should, as at a university, if nothing else, help us and each other remove ourselves from whatever sort of preconceived notions, think about them critically, and consider for once that perhaps someone else's spirituality, someone else's belief system, someone else's answer to prayer might be just as valid as our own. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about my own experience with Muslims, because what I can do today, I don't speak to you really as a scholar of Islam in the Middle East, although I spend a lot of time thinking about it and writing about these issues. But I also want to tell you that my position, I come to you in a position that I am not fearful, that I am hopeful, even given the incredible sort of problems that we see with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Shabab and others. And here's why I'm hopeful. So I grew up in Saudi Arabia, actually. My parents moved us from central Utah to Dhahran, Saudi Arabia in the summer of 1976. And we landed, there was 120 degrees, and it couldn't have been more foreign than if we had landed on Mars, right? And this was 4 years in which it was a very defining experience for me. To remove myself from a very homogeneous experience in Utah and to be parachuted into Saudi Arabia for 4 years, it has a way of changing you, at least changing you in your perspectives of the world. So I want to just point out that's my family there. What I want you to see is how beautiful my mother is. And see that guy on the left there, the beady eye shifty one over here in the corner? He's right here. And he's always been sketchy. It's my brother. Of course, we didn't have to dress like this. But it was an experience for me that when I came back to the United States and got into higher education, I gravitated and migrated to those things related to that part of the world: language, history, politics. My first job out of college actually was in Egypt. And I worked at the American University in Egypt, and it really sort of underscored my desire to make higher education as a profession. So I had the Middle East as an academic interest, and as I worked at the university here, I realized that higher education maybe is my future. My parents were a part of higher education. This sort of underscored that really the ideal for me would be able to work internationally. In that part of the world. So on my way to that eventual goal is I spent 2 years in Kuwait working for an engineering company right after the first Gulf War, which again was one more experience that had an indelible impression on me about war and conflict. I had a great experience here for about 7 years in different capacities at Utah Valley. And again, it was just a great fondness for this place. But this place called me. And I was the president of the Women's College in the UAE. And it might be interesting for you to know that 65% of the students in the United Arab Emirates are women. And it's a fairly young country. And women are taking a much more assertive role in Emirati society. And I'm telling you, working with these women just sort of they outperformed the men on every learning category. It turns out that's not unique to the UAE either. That's something that's sort of worldwide. But these women did not take that education for granted. And the greatest motivation for them were their mothers. Their mothers, were once married very early and really sort of pushed their daughters to get that education. It was a really beautiful experience for me. So what I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about is the dangers and of oversimplification and reductionist views about the Islamic world. It is infuriating to often watch our newscasts and have huge swaths of the Islamic world being painted in some sort of, pejorative way. What we have, I think, is a bad habit in the West to essentially lump things together, right? So for example, if we use the term the Muslim world, we hear it all the time, the Islamic world. How does that sound to you when we say the Christian world? Well, we know intuitively if we talk about the Christian world, we know it's actually quite diverse, right? Christianity practice in Buenos Aires is different than Chicago, which is different than Eritrea, which is different than the Christianity practiced in some parts of China, right? We just sort of intuitively understand that Christianity is highly diverse. And what is true about Islam is it is as diverse, perhaps even more diverse than Christianity. First off, there's 1.5 billion Muslims. There are 44 Muslim majority countries. Most Muslim majorities are not in the Arab world. Vast sort of concentrations of Muslims are really in places like Indonesia and India. There are more Muslims in India than all of the Middle East combined, right? Yet we often in our mind sort of attach sort of a monolithic understanding or perception of what Muslims are. And the truth is it's a very polyvocal religious culture. There are highly contested positions within Islam. It's 1,400 years old. And so it has this vast body of classical jurists and exegetes that have had to sort of look at what's in the scriptures, what's in the Quran, what's in the Hadith, what's in the Sunnah, and try and parse this together about what is sort of the ideal for humans to organize themselves and to live their life. So first off, I think you have to understand the highly diversified nature of Islam and how it, by and large, is practiced. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But the other is that what does Islam say about itself, right? I mean, I think ultimately that's the measure. Not only what does it say about itself, but ultimately, what do those adherents do? Now, clearly, what we have to ask ourselves then is, when we're looking at Islam, what Islam are we talking about, and whose Islam? What Islam and whose Islam are we talking about? Now, if we're talking about the Islam of ISIS, yeah, we ought to be scared. We ought to be nervous. It ought to be fought. It ought to be confronted. But there are all kinds of different Muslim interpretations. But let's just talk about some of the scriptures that, in terms of itself. So this is what in the Quran in chapter 532, whoever kills an innocent human being, it shall be as if he has killed all mankind. And if anyone gives life to another person, it is if he had given life to all mankind. That in itself is unambiguous. The Hadith. So Hadith is really this large collection of the life and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. And this is one thing that Muhammad said, it's recorded by Sahih Muslim, who was a collector of these hadith. Muhammad said this: I recommend you to stand in the awe of God and be good Muslims. Fight in the name of God in his causes, but pay attention here, right? Do not betray, do not be excessive, do not kill a child or a woman or an old person or a person who is secluded in a hermitage. A clear homage to the Christian monks of that era. And I love this one. Do not burn a date tree, nor cut the trees or demolish buildings. In a desert culture like that, you can imagine why trees are at a premium. And I wish that really people had understood that when 9/11, when people crashed into buildings in airplanes, that people would understood that what Islam says is this, and that what those guys did was not representative. So you may say, well, fine, okay, in every sort of scripture, we can proof text, we can sort of take things out of context. But what about the so-called sword verses, right? Those verses that often critics look to Islam and say, yeah, but look at these. Oh, I want to point this one out because this is I love this one because in some ways this scripture here kind of gives you a sense of the universalism possibilities for Islam. And even, might I say, a universal salvation ethic here. Those who believe, so this is in the Quran, right? So those who believe in the Jews and the Christians, those who are Jews and Christians and Sabian. So all those who believe in God in the last day and act rightly will have their reward with their Lord. They will feel no fear and will know no sorrow, as if he has killed. Oh, and I had combined two, but end there. They will feel no fear and will know no sorrow. So here's one though. Let's just take one of these sword verses that people say, yeah, but they're very violent sections of the Quran. Well, the one in red is the one that ends up being sort of extrapolated and read on its own. Let's just read that together, just 191. So if you just read this alone, forget about 190, forget about 182, and let's just read this together. And kill them wherever you overtake them, and expel them from where they had expelled you. Oppression is more serious than murder. But do not fight them at the sacred mosque unless they fight you there, and if they fight you, then kill them. Such is the retribution of disbelievers. So this I picked out as, of several scriptures in the sword verses that can be isolated like this. This is the one that's most quoted. But read with me, if you will, 190 and 192. So, and fight in the cause of God who fight you. Right? Clearly a defensive posture, but do not commit aggression. God does not love the aggressors. And then it goes into that if there is some sort of offensive taking place, there is some sort of just war theory here in which you can defend yourself. But if they cease, then God is merciful and forgiving. So over 1,400 years, right, theologians, jurists, scholars have had to sort of wrestle with these seemingly conflicting kind of verses, right? And what they had never considered was the unprovoked, wanton, unannounced slaughter, right? That is what we're seeing among some groups today. So we also hear of the term jihad, right? Jihad itself actually in Arabic means to struggle, right? And so some will say they're actually the jihad al-akbar, the great jihad, and the jihad al-asghar, the small jihad. But it means to struggle. And what Muslims would say, if you listen to sermons, would they say that we're all committing jihad every day, right? We're struggling to get out of bed. We're struggling to sort of, keep our temper, right? This is the great jihad, right? This is the jihad, the struggle for us to be better people. But Muhammad did talk about this small jihad, which is a defensive position. But here's what we kind of have to know, and let me just sort of lay this out in a way that's not fixed or sort of overly sort of defined, because there is some fluidity and some crossover. So on the one hand, when you take the term jihad, you have a very small, so you think about the 1.5 billion Muslims. On the one side here, if you can think about a spectrum, you have a very small percentage of Muslims who are secularists, who would essentially look at jihad as an artifact of another time, right? The whole term of jihad just needs to be reconceptualized, right? And that's a small group. A larger group is what I would call progressives. That would say, listen, when you look at the classical definitions of jihad, what we need to focus on is really the jihad, right, of the greater jihad. It really is about, how do we struggle to be better people, to be better citizens, to be, greater contributors to society. But that the defensive definition of the smaller jihad is, again, an artifact of the past. The larger group, and I would say the majority of Muslims really are what I would call traditionalists, which look at these scriptures and sort of say, the majority of our life should be emphasis on the greater jihad. And that if there is, if the scriptures do sort of point to some sort of defensive posture, it is only in defense, and it only can come at the behest of the Islamic leader, right? So it never really is sort of invoked. And then what we have on the very far, right, between these four, is jihadists, who would essentially say that jihad, right, that really sort of the best defense is an aggressive offense, right? And you can look at sort of the gymnastics that jihadis end up doing in terms of torturing the scriptures, in terms of justifying the kind of violence that they do. So let me sort of change here. You can read that on your own, but what I'd like to sort of say now is this wasn't my quote, and I think it was Majid Nawaz who said this, who was a Muslim, and he said, listen, Islam is not a religion of peace. It's not a religion of violence. It is a religion. What he means by that is that all major religious traditions, in particular the Abrahamic faiths, have strong, violent DNA in their early histories. Consider, if you were to read the Quran, and I assume that many of you have, one thing that I want you to pay attention to is that if you read the Quran, it's a lot less bloody than the Old Testament. Consider, you probably remember in 1 Samuel, God commands Saul to kill all the Amalekites. Not just the warriors. You kill women, children, donkeys, cows, horses, do it all. And when Saul didn't, right, he lost his kingdom. 2 Chronicles, you might remember Judah killed 500,000 of their fellow Israelites. Remember the story of Joshua, right? And Jericho. Again, the same sort of commandment, to slaughter everybody, not just the men, but all the animals. I'm not sure why the animals, what they did, but that was sort of the order of the day. And so when we talk about sort of the violence in the Bible, we're actually talking about nothing less than genocide. And so when you look at what happened in 7th century desert Arabia, things were relatively humane. But here's the point I want to sort of make, though, is that our own sort of religious traditions, Judaism and Christianity, have our own violent histories. And what I like to call self-righteous amnesia. Think about the Crusades, which were wars motivated from a religious standpoint. But consider this. Think about the religious conflict, the Christian conflict in the 15th and 16th century between the Protestants and the Catholics. Massive wars in Europe over this. And I often wondered that, and what we're seeing here in Islam, with what's going on around the world in the name of Islam, is what you're seeing in real time is a reformation of Islam. What you're seeing is the struggle that Judaism went through. You're seeing the struggle that Christianity went through. But you're seeing it in real time. It's Muslims who are going to solve this problem, not us, as they wrestle, right, with this theology. But you and I are seeing it in real time, with much more lethal weaponry. Consider if we had the same media speed in the 15th and 16th century that we did, what would China, what would Africa, these are non-Christian countries, what would they think of Christianity? What would they think of Christianity with the Inquisition, with the major violence that has occurred between Protestants and Catholics? I think people could draw conclusions that, man, Christianity, if that's what people do, then Christians all must be pretty violent. Well, those of you who are Christian would take a touch on that. That was another time. And how traditions evolve out of that will tell us. But what I will tell you is that all of the foundational elements of peaceful society and coexistence reside in Islam now. It is being co-opted, extorted by criminals and by religious crazies, but nonetheless, but I do think it's going to take time, that through this Reformation, it will right itself. Another point I wanted to sort of help maybe in perspective, put in perspective, is that you have 1,400 years of religious theology and debate and argument. But when it comes to the type of violence that we see today in Islam, is largely since 1979. Where were the massive bombings prior to that? The scripture's the same, the hadith the same, the sunnah's the same. Nothing's changed on that front. But what's happened really is it's more of a reaction to Western intervention than it is a theological debate. It's very, it's true that when we survey people in Islamic majority countries, they have a very negative view of Westerners, including Americans. Is it because they hate Christians? No. In fact, Christianity and Judaism have a special place in Islam called Ahli Kitab, Dhimmi, right? These have a special protection. For 1,400 years, that was the case. The reason why, and this is why I think we have to be really careful, that it isn't Islam that hates us, right? Right? What they take issue with is really about foreign policy. So let me say that what we're seeing here since the last 30 years is this really awful sort of combination, a perfect storm of conditions that have gotten us where we are with this. One, of course, is Western intervention, and what that is clearly done is created an element, and through colonialization, right, this element of humiliation, alienation. Right? So it sets up this grievance narrative in the Islamic majority countries because they point to things like the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Right? You look at the injustices that are happening in Palestine, or the massacres of Muslims in Bosnia, or the sort of kind of Western sort of autocrats that we saw were overthrown during the Arab Spring. So it sets up this grievance narrative that sort of festers. And so there is that level, right, that's going on. The other level that's kind of going on is really a social one that is related to modernity and to secularism, where there's a greater sense of personal isolation, right? There is an atomization, a balkanization of the person, right? And things in certain societies, when you look at some of what's going on, say in some of the Muslim youth in Europe, there is a problem, right, with employment, with an element of boredom. And when people sort of dangle out, like the ISIS leaders, of adventurism, right, to go to Syria and fight, it's often because there's sort of a lack of meaning in their own. These guys aren't drawn to this conflict of ISIS because of theology. I mean, you look at some of these guys that have been captured, they've got Islam for Dummies in their knapsack, right? right? And so it really is about a gang identity, much like what we see in gangs all over the world, that this is a way in which they can identify with each other and perhaps, support each other. I want to read, if you don't mind, I think a pretty good article in the Washington Post the other day from a guy named Arun Kundani. And basically his message is that we started this war on terror because it was better ostensibly to fight them over there than to fight them here. Well, what we found out is that actually war creates terrorism. We're no better off than we were then, than we are. Something is not working. And then I think violence that is done abroad, I think always comes back to us in some form. So let me just read just a couple of things from Kundani's March 23rd article this year. He says, rather than containing violence, the war on terror has turned the whole world into a battlefield, and we should not be surprised. Violence inflicted abroad always comes home in some form. Last year, the U.S. military dropped 22,000 bombs in Iraq and Syria. Indeed, what we know is that war on terror kills more civilians than terrorism does. But we tolerate this because it is their civilians being killed in places that we imagine to be too far away to matter. Because we pay little attention to the effects of our violence in the places we bomb, then it appears to us that terrorism comes out of the blue. When it does happen, then the only way we can make sense of it is by laying blame on Islamic culture or the religion. We assume that religious extremism is the root cause of terrorism. But there really are no, he says, no such correlation that exists, as empirical evidence demonstrate that in the Paris attacks, the perpetrator, Abdelhamid Aboud, who was reported to have drunk whiskey and smoked cannabis. But this has not stopped national security agencies such as the FBI from using radicalization models that assume devout religious belief are indicators of potential terrorism. Consider this, what he says. The process of radicalization is easily understood if we imagine how we would respond to a foreign government dropping 22,000 bombs on us. Large numbers of patriots would be volunteering to fight the perpetrators. And nationalist and religious ideologies would compete with each other to lead that movement and give its adherents a sense of purpose. So what is often difficult to parse out here is the difference between violent religious ideology and violent nationalist ideology. So violent forms of nationalism, right, those forms of king and country, right, this commitment to king and country, are also extremism that we have to be suspicious of, fearful of, and fight against. And sometimes I think it's difficult, for us, for those of us watching this struggle, to differentiate on some of this, on some level. Similarly, the Islamic State does not primarily recruit through theological arguments, but through a militarized identity politics. It says there's a global war between the West and Islam, there's a heroic struggle with truth and justice on one side, and lies and depravity and corruption on the other. And it shows images of innocent victims and battles gloriously waged. In other words, it recruits the same way that any other armed group recruits, including the U.S. military. That means that when we also deploy our own militarized identity politics here to narrate our response to terrorism, we inadvertently reinforce the Islamic State's message to its potential recruits. When Prime Minister David Cameron talks about generational struggle between Western values and Islamic extremism, he is assisting the militants in their own propaganda. When French President François Hollande talks of a war which will be pitiless, he's doing the same. What is distinctive about the Islamic State's message is that it also offers a utopian and apocalyptic vision of an alternative society in the making. The reality of that alternative is, of course, oppression of women, enslavement of minorities, and hatred of freedom. There is no pass for ISIS. There is no pass for Al-Qaeda. And there is no past for Shabab or any other group that wages this kind of tactic. But what we have to understand is it certainly doesn't and shouldn't reflect on the broader, richer, deeper tradition of Islam, which really has the capacity of every peaceful element that we find in Christianity. With the few minutes that I have left, I want to maybe turn to this. As we talk about constructive dialogue, I think that's what today is about, hopefully, is, all right, so if we talk about the facts, so what? What can we do? And I've thought a lot about that the last few days. And let me throw this out and see what you think. One of the greatest, I think, killers of mutual understanding is an insistence on certainty. This is the odd thing about religion. On the one hand, certitude and certainty provide a certain amount of comfort to us, right? It gives us guidance. It gives us something to hold on to. It gives us some answers. But the other side of that is that it's also divisive. And certainty and certitude is a form of damnation. It can be. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. Why? Because if you're so certain, and you're kind of talking or speaking on sensitive issues like this, if you believe that you've got all the answers, then internally you're sort of saying to yourself, that person really doesn't have anything of value to say, because I've got the answers. It damns us, impedes us from other ways of knowing and other ways of thinking. I love Jaggi Vasudev's quote. He was a great yogi. The sign of intelligence is that you are continually wondering. Idiots are always dead sure about every damn thing they're doing. I love that. Darwin actually said something interesting too about this. Ignorance more frequently begets confidence. It is those who know little, not those who know much, who, I would say often, so positively assert this or that. Whitman. I like the scientific spirit, the holding off, the being sure but not too sure, the willingness to surrender ideas when the evidence is against them. This is ultimately fine. It always keeps the way beyond open. It always gives life, thought, affection, the whole man a chance to try over again, and after a mistake, and after a wrong guess. The last couple of thoughts here is, I think, some thoughts about what do we do as a university and as the academy, and I include you students in that group. What do we have to, what should we do? One thing that I am convinced of is that it's education that is the best and greatest hope for our future. Because it's education in a way that can free us from ignorance. It can free us from fear. And hopefully it frees you from enough fear that you aren't going to stay away from experience. Mark Twain is great here. You probably have all read this. But if there's any message that if you have worries and fear about what's going on in the world, those feelings aren't marginalized or minimized. But what I would love for you to do is to get to know a Muslim. It's very hard to hate someone you befriend. Travel, as Twain said, is really fatal to bigotry and prejudice and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's time. And how can we better end any sort of conversation than with Maya Angelou, who says, perhaps travel can't prevent bigotry, but by demonstrating that all people cry, laugh, eat, worry, and die. It can introduce the idea that if we try and understand each other, we may even become friends. Thank you.